and the coin hit the wooden table with a sound that silenced every drunk in McCain's saloon. But that wasn't the sound that made Thaddeus Royce's blood run cold. It was the auctioneer's voice cutting through the tobacco smoke like a rusted blade. Lot, 17. Young, good teeth. Can read and write. Bidding starts at $50. That had walked into McCain's for a simple whiskey after 3 days of mending fences under the Arizona Sunday. The last thing he expected was to witness something that belonged in the darkest chapters of a war he'd tried to forget. His weathered hands gripped the bar as he watched a woman no more than 28, with fierce eyes that refused to show fear, standing on a makeshift platform near the poker tables. Celeste Washington stood with her chin raised, her dark skin gleaming under the oil lamps, wearing a simple blue dress that had seen better days. But it wasn't her appearance that struck Thahad like a lightning bolt. It was the way she looked at every man in that room, not with submission, but with a quiet rage that promised consequences. "Do I hear 60? Vernon McCain called out, his snake-like smile revealing gold teeth. The saloon owner had always been a piece of human garbage. But this crossed every line, Thahad thought, still existed in 1885 Arizona. A fat man in a bowler hat raised his hand. 60, for the kitchen work. 7, shouted another voice from the back. She can teach my boys their letters. Thahad's jaw clenched as he remembered why he'd left civilization behind 15 years ago. People. This was exactly why he preferred the company of cattle and desert wind. His ranch sat 40 miles from town, far enough that he could pretend the world had learned something from all that blood spilled between north and south. But watching Celesta's hands tremble slightly, the only sign that her composure was cracking, brought back memories of Antidum, of watching good men die for the principle that no human being should own another. $80. The bowler hatman was getting excited, now, sweat beating on his forehead. McCain's eyes gleamed with greed. 80 going once. This is a fine specimen, gentlemen. Educated, healthy, prime working years ahead. Thahad's hand moved to the leather pouch at his belt, feeling the weight of the silver dollars inside. Money he'd saved for new breeding stock. Money that represented months of backbreaking work. But as Celeste's gaze swept across the room and locked with his for just a moment, he saw something that made his decision crystal clear. She wasn't just fighting for dignity, she was fighting for her very soul. 80 going twice. And that's when Thaddeus Roy stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor like a gunshot. Every eye in McCain's saloon turned toward the tall, weather-beaten rancher who lived like a ghost on the edge of civilization. But what he was about to do would change everything for both of them. $100. Thad's voice cut through the saloon like a blade through butter, steady and cold as winter steel. The entire room went dead silent. Even the piano player's fingers froze mid-note. Vernon McCain's gold-teethed grin faltered for just a moment before spreading wider like a rattlesnake that had just spotted easy prey. "Well, well," McCain drawled, his beady eyes fixed on Thahad, Thaddeus Royce himself. "Haven't seen you in town for what, 6 months? Thought you'd sworn off civilization entirely." Thahad stepped forward, his spurs clicking against the wooden floor. Every man in the saloon was staring now, and he could feel their confusion like heat radiating from a campfire. Why would the hermit rancher who avoided people like the plague suddenly throw down serious money for a woman? But Thahad wasn't looking at them. His eyes stayed locked on Celeste, who was studying him with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Smart woman in her position, trust was a luxury that could get you killed. $100, Thad repeated, reaching into his pouch and producing 5 $20 gold pieces. They caught the lamplight as he set them, on the nearest table, with deliberate precision. The fat man in the bowler hat sputtered. "Now hold on there, McCain. I was bidding fair and square. Business is business," McCain interrupted, but his tone had shifted. There was something calculating in his expression now, like he was working through a puzzle. "Though I have to say, Royce, this seems out of character. What exactly do you plan to do with educated help out on that godforsaken ranch of yours?" The question hung in the air like smoke, loaded with implications that made Thahad's stomach turn. But he'd learned long ago that the best way to handle snakes like McCain was to meet their poison with ice-cold resolve. "That's my business," Thahad said simply. Celeste's eyes narrowed slightly and Thahad caught the almost imperceptible shake of her head. She was warning him off. This woman standing on an auction block like a piece of livestock was trying to protect him from whatever trap McCain was laying. 110. The bowler hat man wasn't giving up easy. But then McCain raised his hand, and something cold slithered down Thahad's spine. Actually, gentlemen, I'm withdrawing lot 17 from tonight's auction. The room erupted in protests, but McCain's voice rose above them all. You see, I've just remembered that Miss Washington here has some outstanding debts to settle. Legal matters that need sorting before any transactions can take place. Thahad's hand instinctively moved toward his hip, where his Colt 45 rested in its worn leather holster. He'd seen this game before. The shifting rules, the moving goalposts, the way corrupt men twisted law and custom to suit their greed. Celeste's composure finally cracked just for a second, and Thahad saw the flash of pure terror in her eyes before she locked it down again. Whatever McCain was really planning, it was worse than the auction. What kind of debts? Thad asked, his voice deceptively calm. McCain's smile was all teeth and venom, the kind that require more personal attention to. Resolve. Don't you worry about it, Royce. I'm sure a man of your solitary habits can find other ways to spend that money. But as McCain signaled to two of his hired muscle men Thad recognized as the type who solved problems with brass knuckles and shallow graves, he realized this wasn't about money anymore. This was about power. And McCain had just made it clear that he wasn't planning to let Celeste Washington walk out of this saloon alive. The dead is simple, McCain continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the saloon. Miss Washington here killed a white man in self-defense 3 towns over. Sheriff and Tombstone's been looking for her for 2 weeks. The words hit the room like a stick of dynamite. Thahad felt every muscle in his body tense as he processed what McCain had just revealed. If it was true, Celeste wasn't just fighting for her freedom, she was fighting for her life. But something in McCain's tone, the way his eyes glittered with satisfaction, told Thahad there was more to this story than a simple manhunt. Celeste's voice cut through the stunned silence, clear and strong despite her impossible situation. That man tried to force himself on me in a hotel room. I defended myself with a letter opener. Any decent court would call it justified. Decent court, McCain chuckled, shaking his head. Unfortunately, Miss Washington, decent courts don't exist for people like you. And the man you killed? He was the mayor's son. Thad's blood turned to ice water. A mayor's son. In 1885 Arizona, that was a death sentence, regardless of the circumstances. No jury would even pretend to consider self-defense when a black woman killed a white man of prominence. The two hired muscle were moving closer now, their hands resting on their gun belts. But they were being careful, professional. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they'd done it before. Here's what's going to happen, McCain said, addressing the room like he was, announcing the evening's entertainment. Miss Washington is going to come with me to discuss her situation privately, and anyone who interferes will be interfering with official law business. That caught Celeste's eye again, and this time he saw something that made his chest tighten. She wasn't just scared, she was resigned. This woman, who had stood on that auction block with her chin raised like a queen, was preparing to die. What's your real game here, McCain? Thad asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. McCain's smile widened. No game, Royce. Just a civic-minded businessman helping the law do its job. Though, I suppose if someone were to compensate me for the considerable trouble of harboring a fugitive, he let the words hang in the air like a noose. Thahad understood now. This wasn't about justice or law. McCain had been planning this from the moment Celeste walked into his saloon. The auction was just theater, a way to drive up her value before revealing his real leverage. How much? Thad asked. $500 cash. The number hit like a physical blow. $500 was more money than most men saw in 2 years. It was enough to buy a small ranch, a herd of cattle, a new life somewhere far from Arizona's brutal justice. But as Thahad looked at Celeste, really looked at her, he saw something that made the decision easy. In her eyes, behind the fear and resignation, was a spark of hope so fragile it might die if he breathed on it wrong. And Thaddeus Royce had spent 15 years running from moments exactly like this one. $500. Thahad repeated slowly, his weathered fingers drumming against his gun belt. That's a considerable sum for a civic-minded businessman. McCain's eyes narrowed. He'd expected immediate rejection, maybe even violence. But Thahad's calm consideration was throwing him off balance. And in a room full of armed men, balance was everything. The larger of McCain's two hired guns, a scarred man with dead eyes who went by Knuckles, shifted his weight. Forward. Boss, maybe we should just shut up. McCain snapped, never taking his eyes off Thahad. Mr. Royce is thinking. Aren't you, Royce? Thahad was thinking. He was thinking about the 15 years he'd spent telling himself that other people's problems weren't his. Thinking about the ranch that represented every dollar he'd ever, every drop of sweat he'd ever shed, building something that was his alone. But mostly he was thinking about Celeste Washington's hands. How they'd trembled just once when McCain called for the first bid. How they'd steadied when she'd spoken about defending herself. How they were perfectly still now, even though she had to know she was probably going to die in the next 10 minutes. I don't have $500, Thahad said finally. McCain's gold teeth flashed in a triumphant grin. Well, then I guess Miss Washington and I will be having that private conversation after all. But Thahad continued, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet that made every man in the saloon lean forward. I've got something else you might find interesting. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft at the edges. McCain's eyes fixed on it like a hawk spotting prey. What's that supposed to be? Deed to the Circle Ranch. 4,700 acres of prime grazing land, year-round water rights, and a cabin that's been improved every year for the past 15. Thad's voice was steady as granite, worth at least $2,000 to the right buyer. The saloon had gone completely silent now. Even the hired muscle looked stunned. Everyone in 3 counties knew that Thaddeus Royce would rather die than give up his ranch. It was the only thing he'd ever cared about, the only thing that had kept him sane after the war. McCain's greed weared with suspicion across his face. You'd give up your ranch for her? Thad looked at Celeste, and for the first time since he'd walked into this nightmare, she looked genuinely shocked. Her lips parted slightly, and he could see her trying to understand why a stranger would sacrifice everything for someone he'd never even spoken to. I would, Thad said simply. Thad, why? The question came from Celeste herself, her voice barely above a whisper. Thad was quiet for a long moment, remembering cannon smoke and dying boys calling for their mothers, remembering the promise he'd made to himself when he'd finally laid down his rifle and walked away from a war that had taken everything he'd ever believed in. Because some things are worth more than land, he said finally. McCain was practically drooling now, but something in his expression had shifted. The greed was still there, but it was mixed with a cold calculation that made Thahad's skin crawl. Interesting offer, Royce. But here's the thing. I don't think you're in a position to negotiate. That's when Knuckles and his partner drew their guns. The metallic whisper of steel clearing leather cutting through the silence like a scythe. And Thahad realized with crystal clarity that McCain had never intended to let any of them walk out of this saloon alive. But what McCain didn't know was that Thaddeus Royce hadn't survived Antietam Gettysburg and 15 years of Apache raids by being slow on the draw. Thahad's Colt 45 cleared leather faster than a striking rattlesnake, the barrel swinging toward Knuckles before the hired gun could even thumb back his hammer. But instead of firing, Thahad froze, his finger hovering over the trigger like a man balancing on the edge of a cliff. Because Celeste Washington had stepped directly into his line of fire. Don't, she said quietly, her eyes locked on his. The moment you pull that trigger, every lawman in Arizona territory will be hunting you down, and they'll call you the man who started a gunfight to help a fugitive escape. Knuckles laughed. A sound like grinding glass. Smart girl. Drop the iron cowboy before someone gets hurt. Thahad's mind raced through the impossible mathematics of survival. 3 armed men, plus however many more McCain had scattered throughout the saloon. Even if he was fast enough to drop Knuckles and his partner, McCain would disappear into the crowd and Celeste would be dead before sunrise. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something that stopped his heart cold. She wasn't trying to save him from the law. She was trying to save him from becoming the kind of man who solved problems with violence. The kind of man he'd fought so hard to leave behind after the war. "Put it down, Thad," she whispered. And hearing his name from her lips was like hearing absolution from an angel. "If you were Thaddeus Royce, what would you do? Trust a woman you just met and surrender your only advantage, knowing it might mean both your deaths, or take the shot and live with the blood on your hands forever? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose. Because what Thad decided next would determine whether either of them saw another sunrise. Slowly, deliberately, Thad lowered his weapon. The collective exhale from 30 men filled the saloon like a prairie wind. But McCain's smile was pure poison. "Excellent choice," McCain purred. "Now, Miss Washington, shall we discuss your dead in private?" But as McCain gestured toward the back stairs that led to his office and the soundproof room where he conducted his most brutal business, Celeste did something that caught everyone off guard. She laughed. It wasn't hysteria or desperation. It was the laugh of a woman who had just realized she held better cards than anyone at the table. "You know what's funny, Mr. McCain," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent saloon. "You keep talking about debts and legal matters, but you haven't asked the most important question." McCain's confidence flickered. "What question?" "Why I came to your saloon in the first place." Celeste reached into the hidden pocket of her dress and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages filled with neat handwriting. "You see, I wasn't running from the law and Tombstone. I was gathering evidence." She opened the journal, and even from across the room, Thad could see columns of numbers, dates, and names. McCain's face went white as desert sand. 3 years of records, Celeste continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. Every stolen horse, every rigged card game, every girl who disappeared upstairs and never came back down, all documented with names, dates, and witness accounts. The hired muscle looked confused, but McCain understood perfectly. His entire criminal empire meticulously documented by a woman educated enough to make it stick in court. "The real question is," Celeste said, snapping the journal shut, "what's that worth to you? If you're enjoying these tales of courage and justice from the Old West, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat." McCain's face went through a dozen emotions in the space of a heartbeat. Shock, rage, calculation, and finally, cold murder. But it was Knuckles who spoke first, his scarred features twisting into confusion. "Boss, what's she talking about? What records?" "Shut up," McCain snarled. But the damage was already done. Every man in the saloon was now looking at him with new eyes, wondering what secrets he'd been keeping, what crimes he'd committed that could be worth more than a woman's life. Celeste held the journal against her chest like a shield. "Copies are already with 3 different people in 3 different towns. If I don't check in every week, they go straight to the territorial marshal." It was a beautiful bluff, and Thad had to admire the steel it took to deliver it while standing on an auction block surrounded by armed men. But he could see the calculation in McCain's eyes, weighing the risks, planning his next move. "You're lying," McCain said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Celeste opened the journal again and read aloud. "March 15th, 1885. Horse theft. You and Knuckles stole 6 head from the Morrison Ranch, rebranded them, and sold them in Tucson for $200. The brand iron you used is hidden in the false bottom of your office safe." Knuckles went pale. How could she possibly know that? "April 2nd, Celeste continued, ignoring him. "Sarah McKinnon, 16 years old, last seen entering your private room upstairs. Her body was found 3 days later in Devil's Canyon with her throat cut." The silence in the saloon had turned deadly. Several men were backing toward the doors, suddenly very interested in being anywhere else. Murder was one thing, but the murder of young girls crossed lines that even hardened criminals wouldn't touch. McCain's hand moved toward his gun, but Thad was ready. The moment McCain's fingers twitched, Thad's Colt was back in his hand, this time with a clear shot. "I wouldn't," Thad said quietly, but McCain wasn't looking at him anymore. His eyes were fixed on something behind Thad, and his lips were curving into a smile that made rattlesnakes look friendly. "Actually, Royce, I think you would, because you're forgetting something important." Thad felt the cold press of a gun barrel against the back of his neck before he heard the footsteps. He'd been so focused on the threat in front of him that he'd forgotten about McCain's other employees, the bartender, the piano player, the men who'd been sitting quietly at the tables, waiting for their moment. "Drop it," a voice whispered in his ear. Nice and slow, Thahad's mind raced through the geometry of the situation. Too many guns, too many angles. Even if he spun and fired, Celeste would be caught in the crossfire, and McCain would have what he wanted anyway. But as he started to lower his weapon, Celeste caught his eye and mouthed a single word: "Trust." Then she threw the journal straight up into the air. Every eye in the saloon followed its arc toward the oil lamps hanging from the ceiling. And in that moment of distraction, three things happened simultaneously. Celeste dove behind the poker table, the man behind Thahad turned to track the journal's flight, and Thaddeus Royce remembered why he'd survived the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. He didn't think, he just moved. The saloon erupted into chaos as Thahad spun, his elbow connecting with his captor's nose in a spray of blood. Gunshots thundered through the confined space, muzzle flashes strobing like lightning. And suddenly, everyone was shooting at everyone else in the smoke-filled darkness. But in all the confusion, one thing was crystal clear. Vernon McCain was running for the back door, and he had Celeste's journal clutched in his bloody hands. Thahad burst through the saloon's back door into the cool desert night, his boots pounding against the wooden boardwalk as he spotted McCain's silhouette disappearing around the corner of the general store. Behind him, gunshots still echoed from inside the saloon, but all that mattered now was catching the snake before he slithered away with the only evidence that could save Celeste's life. McCain was fast for a man his age, but 15 years of ranch work had kept that lean and strong. He gained ground with every stride, his spurs ringing against the hard-packed earth of the main street like deadly music. "McCain." Thahad's voice carried across the empty street like thunder. The saloon owner spun around, his face twisted with rage and desperation. In his left hand, he clutched Celeste's journal. In his right, a Smith & Wesson revolver glinted in the moonlight. "Should have minded your own business, Royce," McCain panted, raising his weapon. "Now, you'll die with the rest of them." But as McCain's finger tightened on the trigger, a voice cut through the night air like a blade. "Vernon McCain, you're under arrest for murder, horse theft, and conspiracy." Both men turned to see a tall figure emerging from the shadows beside the sheriff's office. The badge on his chest caught the starlight, and his calm voice carried the authority of federal law. "Marshal Coleman," McCain breathed, his face going white as bone. "What are you doing here?" United States Marshal James Coleman stepped into the light, his weathered features set in granite, following up on some very interesting telegrams I've been receiving. "Seems someone's been documenting your activities quite thoroughly." Thahad felt his heart skip as understanding dawned. Celeste hadn't been bluffing about the copies. She'd been in contact with federal marshals all along. "The woman in your saloon," Coleman continued, his hand resting easily on his gun butt, "has been working as an agent of this office for the past 6 months, and that journal you're holding contains enough evidence to hang you 3 times over." McCain's laugh was high and desperate. "Agent. She's a fugitive. She killed a man in Tombstone. She killed a man who was trying to rape her while she was investigating his connection to your horse theft operation," Coleman corrected. "And the territorial governor has already signed a full pardon based on the evidence she provided." The truth hit Thahad like a physical blow. Celeste Washington wasn't a victim running from the law. She was an undercover federal agent who'd been working to bring down McCain's entire criminal network. Everything that had happened tonight, from the auction to the journal revelation, had been carefully orchestrated. McCain's eyes darted between the marshal and Thahad, calculating his chances. Then his face hardened with the resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Maybe so," he snarled, "but she's still in that saloon with my boys. And unless you want to find her body in the morning, you'll let me walk away right now." But as the words left his mouth, footsteps echoed from the direction they'd come. Celeste Washington emerged from the shadows, very much alive, with Knuckles and his partner walking ahead of her with their hands raised. Behind them came the surviving members of McCain's gang, all in custody, all looking. like men who just discovered they'd been outplayed by a woman half their size. McCain's shoulders sagged as the weight of his situation crashed down on him. The journal slipped from his fingers, hitting the dust with a soft thud that sounded like the closing of a coffin lid. "It's over, Vernon," Marshal Coleman said quietly, drawing his handcuffs. "You've got nowhere left to run." But Thad barely heard the arrest. His eyes were fixed on Celeste as she approached, her blue dress torn and dusty from the fight, but her spirit unbroken. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd never really been in danger, who'd been in control of the situation from the very beginning. "Agent Washington," the marshal nodded respectfully. "Outstanding work. The territorial governor will be very pleased." Celeste smiled, but her eyes sought out Thad's. "Thank you, Marshal. But I couldn't have done it without Mr. Royce here." His intervention created the perfect opportunity to expose McCain's operation. Thad felt his world tilt sideways. "You knew from the moment I stood up in that saloon. You knew exactly what was going to happen." "Not exactly," Celeste admitted, moving closer. "I knew McCain would try to use the fake murder charge to extort money, and I knew he'd eventually reveal his hand when cornered, but I didn't know someone would be brave enough to offer their life savings for a stranger." She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers warm against his skin or their ranch. The deed was still in Thad's vest pocket, yellowed and worn from 15 years of hard living. His entire life, everything he'd built after the war, offered up without hesitation for a woman he'd thought was doomed. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because," Celeste said, her voice soft but steady, "I needed to know what kind of man you really were. And now I do." Marshal Coleman cleared his throat diplomatically. "Agent Washington, your assignment here is complete. You're free to, and return to Denver for reassignment." Or he glanced meaningfully between her and Thad. "Take some well-deserved leave." McCain was loaded into the marshal's wagon, along with his surviving men, but Thad barely noticed. He was lost in Celeste's eyes, trying to process everything that had happened in the span of one impossible night. "So, what happens now?" he asked. Celeste was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the vast Arizona sky scattered with stars. "Well, I suppose that depends. You offered me freedom tonight, Mr. Royce. The question is, what would you say to a partnership? What kind of partnership?" Her smile was like sunrise after the darkest night. The kind where a retired federal agent helps a rancher build something better than either of them could manage alone. The kind where two people who've seen the worst of humanity try to create something good. Bad thought about his empty ranch, his solitary life, the years of telling himself that isolation was safer than hope. Then he thought about the courage it had taken for Celeste to walk into McCain's saloon alone, knowing she might not walk out alive. "The Circle R could use someone who knows how to read and write," he said finally. "And someone who's not afraid of a fight, and Celeste Washington could use a place to call home," she replied. "Somewhere far enough from town that a woman and a man can build a life without people asking too many questions about the past." As the marshal's wagon disappeared into the darkness and the saloon fires were finally extinguished, Thad and Celeste stood together in the street where their lives had changed forever. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new possibilities, and the hard work of building something real from the ashes of everything they'd left behind. But tonight, under the endless Arizona stars, two souls who'd found each other in the darkest of circumstances began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd found something worth more than gold. Something worth more than land, something worth fighting for. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, more intense, more profound, the kind that makes your soul freeze and your heart race. Click on the video